The day started the same way all days started, at the Galactic Unified Academy on Verith Prime, with noise, movement, and the smell of 100 different species filling the wide stone corridors of the main hall. Cadet Sirith walked with his shoulders back and his chin raised, the way Velhari warriors were expected to carry themselves at all times, even between classes, even during meals, even when no one was watching, because someone was always watching at the academy, and weakness was a thing that spread fast once it was seen. He was 22 years old and already ranked third in his combat theory class, second overall in physical assessments, and first in the eyes of most of his peers, who followed him through the corridors the way smaller animals follow the largest predator in a forest, not out of love, but out of a deep and sensible understanding of where the power was. It was the start of a new semester, and the transport decks had been busy since before sunrise. New cadets arrived in groups, clutching their registration papers and looking around with wide eyes at the carved walls and the tall windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, and let in the pale gold light of Verith Prime's twin suns. Sirith had stopped noticing the light a long time ago. He watched the new arrivals the way he watched everything, quietly, with his amber eyes moving from face to face, reading species, reading posture, reading the small signs that told a trained observer who was going to matter and who was going to wash out before the first season ended. He had done this 3 times before, at the start of each new year, and he was good at it. He could tell the Dorkai boy near the fountain was already exhausted from the journey and would probably struggle in the physical training program for the first month. He could tell the twin Marin girls by the eastern entrance had been trained at home before arriving and carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who already knew they were good. And then he saw the human. She was standing near the registration desk with a single bag over one shoulder and a small piece of paper in her hand, and she was reading the paper in the slow, careful way of someone who was trying to memorize what was on it rather than simply understand it. She was not tall. She was not large. She had dark hair cut short and plain, and she wore the standard pre-enrollment uniform that the academy sent to all new cadets before arrival. Gray jacket, gray trousers, gray boots, but it looked on her the way that kind of uniform always looked on humans, which was to say, it looked like it had been made for someone else, and she was wearing it anyway, because she had no other choice. Sirith looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked away. There was nothing to see. Her name, he would learn later that day, when the registration lists were posted on the common board, was Mara Voss. Her species classification read, Human, subclassification, None. Her home was listed as Caro Station, a small agricultural moon on the outer rim of the Caliph system, which was a part of the galaxy that no one at the Academy had ever visited, or had any particular reason to visit, because nothing of military or political significance had ever happened there. Her academic record was clean but unremarkable, standard scores, no specializations, no noted achievements, no letters of recommendation from anyone whose name meant anything. There was no military lineage, there was no psionic rating, there were no enhanced genetics on file, no record of accelerated training, no mention of previous service in any branch of any armed force or intelligence organization belonging to any recognized species. She was by every measure the Academy used to evaluate incoming cadets, completely ordinary. Sirith read her file once, closed it in his mind, and moved on. The first week of the new semester passed the way first weeks always passed: orientation sessions, equipment checks, uniform fittings, and the long, slow process of sorting cadets into their assigned courses based on their scores and their species and their declared areas of study. Mara Voss was placed in the same morning combat theory class as Sirith, which was not unusual. The class was large, with cadets from 11 different species, and Professor Henvarath, a Dorkai veteran with gray at his temples and a long scar across his jaw from a conflict he never named, ran it with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been explaining the same concepts to young soldiers for 30 years and expected to be doing it for 30 more. The first topic of the semester was classical engagement doctrine. the accepted framework of how organized armed forces had conducted warfare for the last 400 years across most of the known galaxy. A framework built on superiority of force, predictable escalation, and the assumption that both sides in any conflict shared a basic interest in not being completely destroyed. It was a good framework. It had ended more wars than it had started, and most tacticians across most species considered it the foundation of everything else. Professor Henverath was 40 minutes into his explanation of the doctrine's core principles when Mara Voss raised her hand. He paused. He looked at her. She was sitting in the middle row, third seat from the left, and her hand was raised in the very small and careful way that people raise their hands when they are not sure whether they are allowed to ask a question, but have decided to ask it anyway. Professor Henverath nodded at her. She said, in a voice that was quiet and did not carry any obvious challenge, that she had a question about the doctrine's assumption of mutual survival interest. Specifically, she wanted to know what happened to the framework when one side in a conflict did not share that assumption, when one side had already decided it was willing to absorb total destruction as an acceptable outcome, if it meant it could inflict sufficient damage before it was gone. The room went a little quiet. Not completely quiet, because there were still the small sounds of cadets shifting in their seats, and the distant noise of the academy outside the windows, but the specific kind of quiet that falls in a classroom when someone has said something that the professor was not expecting. Professor Henverath looked at Mara for a long moment. He then looked at his notes. He then looked at the wall. He said, after a pause that went a beat longer than it should have, that this was actually a concept from advanced asymmetric warfare theory. Course, and that it would be covered in detail at a later point in the curriculum. Mara nodded and lowered her hand and looked back at her desk. Sirith, who was sitting 4 rows behind her, watched this happen. He told himself it was a fluke, a well-read cadet, a lucky question, someone who had skimmed ahead in the reading materials and found something that sounded impressive. It meant nothing. That evening he saw her in the Academy's East Corridor, near the restricted archive terminal, the one that required a security clearance code to operate, the one that even third-year cadets were not automatically permitted to use without a specific academic reason logged and approved in advance. She was not breaking into the terminal. She was not attempting to bypass anything. She was using it calmly and directly, the way you use a door when you have a key, typing in a clearance code and waiting for the screen to confirm access, and then opening a file that Sirith could not see from where he stood at the end of the corridor. She stayed at the terminal for 11 minutes. Then she closed everything down, picked up her bag, and walked back toward the dormitories without looking up. Sirith stood at the end of the corridor for a while after she was gone. He did not know what to think about what he had just seen. He did not know what a new human cadet from an agricultural moon on the outer rim was doing with a clearance code that most senior cadets did not possess. He told himself again that it probably meant nothing. The annual war games were held in the 4th week of the semester, and they were, as they had always been, the single event that every cadet at the Galactic Unified Academy cared about more than anything else in the first term. Not because the results affected grades in any meaningful way. Not because the prizes for the winning team were worth talking about. They were small medals and a line in the Academy record, and no serious cadet at the Academy cared about medals. The war games mattered because they were the first real chance for every cadet to be seen by the people who decided things. Professors, senior commanders, the off-world observers who arrived every year and sat in the high gallery above the simulation hall, and took notes that could end up shaping careers for decades. Everyone wanted to be seen. The teams were assembled by the Academy's allocation system, which used a formula that balanced species, skill levels, and year of enrollment to create groups that were roughly equal in projected ability. The one exception to this rule was that new cadets, regardless of species or preliminary assessment scores, were always placed on the weaker teams as a balancing measure, on the theory that untested soldiers added uncertainty to any unit, and that uncertainty, in the Academy's experience, usually expressed itself as a liability rather than an asset. Mara Voss was placed on Team 7. Team 7 was, by the Academy's own assessment numbers, the weakest assembled group in that year's games. It was made up of 2 mid-ranked third-year cadets from species that were not known for their military traditions, 3 second-year cadets who had spent most of the previous year struggling with the physical requirements of the program, 1 first-year cadet from a diplomatic family who had very clearly never intended to be placed anywhere near a combat simulation, and Mara. The other teams had stronger rosters. Team 3 had Cyrith, who was, by the numbers, the best cadet in the games. Team 1 had 3 Dorkai cadets who had grown up doing nothing but military training since before they could speak. Team 7 had none of these things. The games ran over 3 days, with engagements scheduled in rotating pairs using the Academy's full simulation system. A massive underground installation that could reproduce almost any terrain, any weather condition, and any tactical scenario the system's designers had loaded into it over the last 60 years. On the first day, Team 7 was matched against Team 5. Team 5 won most of its individual engagements during regular training. Team 7 was expected to lose. Sisreth was in the observer gallery for the first day's first engagement, watching on the large display screens alongside a group of third-year cadets who were not competing until the afternoon. And he saw the moment things started to go wrong for Team 5. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a large explosion or a sudden charge, or any of the things that looked good on a simulation record. It was a quiet shift in positioning. Team 7, pulling back from a defensible position they had every conventional reason to hold, moving in a direction that made no tactical sense to any of the observers in the gallery, including 2 of the professors who were making notes on their tablets and had paused mid-sentence to watch. One of them said out loud that it was a mistake. It was not a mistake. Team 5 followed, because the doctrine said to follow a retreating force and deny them the chance to regroup. And as they followed, they moved into a terrain pocket that Team 7 had apparently identified as useful 3 moves earlier, and the engagement ended in 4 minutes. Team 5 was eliminated. Team 7 had no casualties. The gallery was quiet for a moment. Then one of the observers in the high seats leaned over and sent something to the person next to him, and both of them looked at the display that showed Team 7's positioning, and one of them started writing something down. Sisreth watched the display and tried to remember where he had seen that terrain pocket maneuver before. He could not place it. On the second day, Team 7 beat Team 2 and Team 8. On the third day, they beat Team 3. They beat Team 3, which had Sisreth in it, and they beat them cleanly, without luck, and without the kind of chaotic scrambling that sometimes let weaker teams win when stronger ones made errors. They beat them with a plan that had apparently been built before the engagement started, that accounted for the way Cyrith's team moved, and the decisions they were most likely to make based on their training, and that used the specific weaknesses of those likely decisions against them in a sequence that felt, to Cyrith standing in the middle of it, like being led through a room in the dark by someone who had memorized the furniture. He was not gracious about it in the moment. He was gracious about it afterward, because he was trained to be, but in the moment, he stood in the middle of the simulation field with his team eliminated around him, and looked across the terrain at the 7 people who had done it. And he found Mara Voss standing at the back of the group, not at the front, not celebrating, not doing anything at all except watching, with her hands in her pockets, and her face still and expressionless, in the way that faces are expressionless when the person wearing them is thinking about something else entirely. She had not commanded Team 7 loudly. No one had seen her issue orders. What the observers had noticed, and what several of them had written down and compared notes on afterward, was that she had a habit of walking up to teammates during the brief pauses between movements, and saying something quietly. A few words, never more. And then whatever she had said would turn into the team's next action, smoothly and without argument, the way water turns into the shape of whatever container it is poured into. Cyrith spent 2 evenings after the games were finished, going through the tactical records the Academy posted for all completed engagements. He was looking for the source of Team 7's approach. The patterns were recognizable to him, in the way that certain music is recognizable. He could feel that he had heard it before, could feel the structure of it, but could not name the piece. He asked a favor from a third-year cadet, who had access to the Academy's historical archive, and the cadet pulled the tactical records from 400 years of documented conflicts and ran a comparison against Team 7's game patterns. The results came back the next morning. The tactical approach was consistent with documented strategies used during the Silence Wars, a brutal, poorly recorded conflict that had taken place in a remote region of the galaxy 2 centuries before humanity had achieved anything close to spaceflight. There was no reason any cadet at the Academy should know about the Silence Wars. There was especially no reason a new human student from an agricultural moon should know about them well enough to apply their methods to a live simulation. Sireth sat with the comparison results for a long time. He then walked to the office of Commander Ven Orath, who ran Academy security, and had the authority to pull full enrollment files on any student at any time. He told the commander what he had found. Ven Orath, who was a Dorkai veteran and did not impress easily, listened without expression while Sireth laid out the comparison results, and the archive access, and the question he could not answer, which was where a first-year human cadet had learned to fight like a soldier from a war that most historians had never heard of. Then Ven Orath told Sireth to go back to class, and said he would look into it. Sireth went back to class. That afternoon, Ven Orath pulled Maravas's full enrollment file. The file came back to him partially redacted, not in the way that student files were sometimes incomplete because records were missing or transfers had been poorly processed, but in the deliberate and structured way that classified files are redacted, where the information has been intentionally removed and replaced with clearance-level markers. And at the bottom of the file, where the originating organization's stamp should have been, was a symbol that Ven Orath did not recognize. He had been in military service for 31 years. He knew the insignia of every major organization in the Galactic Union. He did not know this one. He sent an inquiry to the Galactic Union Intelligence Bureau that evening, flagging the redactions and requesting clarification on the organization's stamp. The response came back in less than 4 minutes. The Bureau's standard response time for routine inquiries was between 4 and 7 days. Ven Orath read the response twice. Do not investigate further. It said, she is not a threat to the Academy. And then it said, in a line that Ven Orath read 3 times before he was sure he had read it correctly, she is the Academy's protection. He sat in his office for a long time after that. Outside the window, in the pale gold light of the twin suns going down behind the Academy's western towers, a small figure in gray walked across the courtyard below, with a bag over one shoulder, and stopped for a moment to look up at the sky. She stood there for exactly 10 seconds. The crisis started at night, the way most crises do, when the people who are supposed to be watching are tired, and the people who are supposed to be safe are sleeping. Sireth was in the 3rd-floor study room, working through a targeting calculation he had been stuck on for 2 days, when the Academy's internal alarm system made a sound he had never heard before. Not the standard drill tone, not the fire system, not the medical alert, but a low and serious sound that sat in the chest like a stone and did not stop. He was at the window in 4 seconds. The courtyard below was empty, except for 2 Academy security officers who were moving fast toward the lower sectors, the underground part of the Academy complex, where the maintenance systems and storage areas and certain classified equipment bays were housed. He heard someone in the corridor say the word hostages. He heard someone else say Cathari. The Cathari were not a species he knew well. He knew the name from political briefings, a faction of separatists from a mid-rim system who had been in various stages of conflict with the Galactic Union for about 15 years, sometimes through political channels and sometimes through violence, and who had recently been getting more interested in the second option. The Academy on Vereth Prime had been on a low-level security advisory for 3 months because of this, but low-level advisories were common, and most people at the Academy had stopped thinking about it, in the way that people stop thinking about warning signs when the warning signs have been there long enough without anything happening. Something was happening now. The information came out in pieces over the next hour, through the emergency communication channel that all cadets were required to monitor in their rooms during active alerts. A group of Cathari operatives, 17 of them according to the initial report, had entered the Academy's lower sectors through a maintenance access point that should have been locked, and had apparently been unlocked from the inside by someone who either did not know what they were doing or had been persuaded to do it. They had taken 40 cadets hostage in the lower storage areas, cadets who had been in the lower sectors for various authorized reasons, including 3 who were the children of high-ranking political figures from different systems. The Academy's security team had deployed immediately. The Academy's security team had been neutralized in 11 minutes, not killed. The Cathari had been careful about that, which was not reassuring in the way that restraint from people who are holding hostages is never really reassuring. It meant they were organized, and they had thought ahead, and they had a plan that did not require killing security officers, which was worse than if they had simply been violent, because it suggested a level of planning that was harder to counter. Cyreth went to his assigned muster point on the 2nd floor, and stood with the other cadets who had been directed there by the emergency protocol, and he waited, and he thought, and he watched the other cadets around him for signs of who was going to stay useful under pressure, and who was going to become a problem. After 30 minutes, he noticed something. He noticed that Mara Voss was not at the muster point. She was not in the room. He checked the other muster points on the emergency display board. The system tracked cadet locations through their ID badges during active alerts, and her indicator light was moving. Not toward any muster point. Down. It was moving down, through the internal stairwells, toward the lower sectors. Cyreth stood very still for a moment. Then he pulled out his personal communicator and checked the Cathari's status on the security channel, which cadets were not supposed to be monitoring, but which most of them had found a way to access in the first week of enrollment, because this was a military academy, and the cadets who attended it were not the kind of people who accepted information restrictions without finding a workaround. The Cathari had 17 operatives active at the start of the crisis. As Cyreth watched the security channel, that number began to change. Not because of anything the Academy's security team was doing. They were still contained on the 3rd sublevel, where the Cathari had secured them. The number changed because one by one, the Cathari's operatives began to go offline on their own internal communication network. The security team had a passive tap on that network, which was how they knew about it. The first operative went offline at the 41-minute mark, then another at 43 minutes, then 2 more together at 46 minutes. There were no sounds, there were no explosions. There was no alert from the Cathari's remaining operatives warning each other that something was happening, because the operatives who were going offline were not being given the chance to send a warning before they went. By the 58th minute, all 17 Cathari operatives were off the network. At the 63rd minute, the hostages began to appear in the upper corridors. They came out in small groups, confused and frightened and unhurt, and they were escorted by Academy staff to the medical station. And when the security team finally reached the lower storage areas, they found the 17 Cathari operatives bound, unconscious, and arranged with a precision that suggested whoever had done the arranging had taken a moment to make it neat. On top of the nearest bound operative was a detailed intelligence document. It contained the full organizational structure of the Cathari separatist network, the names of their inside contact at the Academy, the location of their staging base, and a breakdown of their communication protocols with enough specificity that the Galactic Union intelligence services could dismantle the network completely within a week. No one had asked for this document. No one had authorized anyone to produce it. It was simply there, written in clean standard script on plain paper, as if someone had sat down between engagements and done some filing. The security team looked at the document for a long time. Then they looked at each other. Then they started making calls. Cyreth was at the muster point when the all clear came through, and he was one of the first cadets to be directed back to regular areas. And as he walked through the corridor toward the dormitory wing, he passed Mara Voss, coming from the direction of the eastern stairwell. She had her bag on her shoulder. She had been studying somewhere quiet, and had decided to come back to the dormitory at a reasonable hour. She did not look like she had been in a fight. She did not look injured. She did not look like anything in particular. She nodded at Cyrith in the small, polite way that cadets who had been assigned to the same combat theory class nodded at each other in corridors, and kept walking. Cyrith stopped. He turned and watched her walk away. When the security team arrived at her dormitory room 20 minutes later to ask if she had seen anything or if she was aware of her badge showing her in the lower sectors during the alert, she said she had heard a commotion and gone to see what it was, and then, realizing she was in an unauthorized area, had come back up as quickly as she could. She said this calmly. She offered to provide a written account if one was needed. She was polite and cooperative, and gave the security officers no reason to push harder. The next morning, one of the freed hostages, a young Velhari noble named Cadet Tharvin, who was 17 years old and had been near the front of the hostage group, found Cyrith in the meal hall and sat across from him without being invited. He sat there for a moment without speaking, stirring his morning drink. Then he said that in the dark of the lower storage area, when things had been very bad and very frightening and he had not known if anyone was coming, he had heard a sound near the air access panel in the corner of the room. He had heard someone moving through the panel, and then a voice had come from the dark, very low, very steady, not loud enough to be heard by anyone more than 3 feet away. The voice had said, "Do not move." The voice had said, "You are safe." The voice had said, "I have done this before." Tharvin looked at Cyrith. He said he did not know who the voice belonged to. Cyrith looked down at his meal. He said nothing. But he knew. Then Orath had been told not to investigate further. He investigated further. He was 64 years old, and had spent 31 of those years in various branches of military service across 4 different star systems. And in his experience, the instruction "do not investigate further" was something that was said by 2 kinds of people. People who were hiding something dangerous, and people who were protecting something important. The message from the Bureau had felt like the second kind. But he needed to know. He used the back channels that old soldiers use, the informal networks built over decades of shared service, the contacts who owed favors, the people who had left official positions, but still had access to things that official positions were not supposed to touch. It took him 6 days. What he found over those 6 days restructured his understanding of humanity in a way that he would spend a long time afterward trying to absorb. He had known about humanity's entry into the Galactic Union 31 years ago. He had been part of the Union force that made first contact, in fact, a junior officer on a diplomatic vessel, standing in the back of a room while senior officials spoke carefully to the representatives of a species that had only achieved spaceflight 14 years earlier. He remembered thinking that they seemed young, fragile in the way that new things are fragile, emotional in ways that older species had learned to moderate, not dangerous. What the back channels told him, piece by piece over 6 days, was that the humanity he had met 31 years ago was not the first version of humanity that the galaxy had encountered. The first version, or rather, the version that had existed before the Union found them, had already been tested 3 times. The first test had come from a species called the Vetheran, who had found Earth's solar system 60 years before humanity developed FTL travel, and had arrived not with communication, but with ships designed to process planets for resource extraction. The Vetheran had expected a straightforward operation. They had found something they were not prepared for. The war had lasted 9 years. The Vetheran had found something they were not prepared for. The war had lasted 9 years. Ron left. They did not send a second expedition. The second and third contacts had gone similarly. Different species, different methods, same result. Humanity had fought all 3 conflicts alone, without allies, without FTL capability, without the resource base or the technological sophistication of any of the species they had faced. They had won all 3. In the silence between those conflicts, The decades when humanity sat on its own planet, with the knowledge that the galaxy was real, and that parts of it wanted to destroy them. They had built something. The organization had a name. Aegis, the Autonomous Expeditionary Ghost and Intelligence Service. It had been created during what humanity called the Isolation Century, the 100 years between the Third Contact War and their entry into the Galactic Union, when they had spent every resource they had on making sure they would never be caught unprepared again. Aegis operatives were not soldiers in the way that most species understood soldiers. They were trained from a young age in the kind of work that did not have a name in most military traditions. Not combat exactly, not intelligence exactly, but the thing that lived between those two categories, the thing that happened in quiet places when the people who usually handled problems were not fast enough or could not be seen to be involved. They were embedded throughout the galaxy, in governments, in diplomatic services, in academies, not as spies gathering information for humanity's benefit, but as something stranger and more uncomfortable, as a preventative measure, a system of early intervention designed to stop the kinds of conflicts that could spiral into galaxy-wide disasters before they reached the point where conventional forces would be needed. Humanity, having nearly been extinguished 3 times, had become deeply and personally invested in making sure that the galaxy remains stable enough for everyone to survive in. Then Arath sat with this information for a long time. He understood what it meant. He understood that the quiet young woman who was attending his academy and watering her plant in her dormitory window and helping younger cadets with their homework was not a student who happened to know things she should not. She was exactly what the Bureau's message had said she was. He found her that evening in the Eastern Library, sitting at a small table near the window, with a textbook open in front of her, that she appeared to be reading genuinely, not as a pretense. He sat down across from her without asking. She looked up. She did not look surprised. He put the file he had assembled on the table between them, 6 days of back-channel inquiry, printed and organized in the neat way he did everything, and he watched her face while she looked at it. Her face did not change in any significant way. She looked at the file the way a person looks at a map of their own neighborhood, with recognition, and with the slightly tired expression of someone who had known this moment would come and had been wondering when. She said that he had been thorough. He said he had been told not to investigate. She said she knew. He asked her to explain, and she did. She spoke for 40 minutes, in the same quiet voice she used in class and in the corridors, and she told him about Aegis, and about what it did, and about why it had been built, and about the 3 contact wars that most of the galaxy did not know had happened, because humanity had been very careful about what it said when it finally joined the Union. Careful not to seem threatening, careful to present itself as the young and fragile species that Ven Orath and everyone else had seen when the diplomatic ships arrived. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he sat with the silence for a moment. Then he asked her how old she was. She said 26. He asked when she had started this work. She said 17. He looked at her. She looked back at him. She did not look like someone who had been doing dangerous work since she was 17 years old, and she also exactly looked like someone who had been doing dangerous work since she was 17 years old, and these two things were both true at the same time in the specific and unsettling way that they are only true in people who have been shaped by something large and have learned to carry the shape of it without showing the weight. He asked the question that had been building since the first day Cyreth had walked into his office. He asked her why the academy? Why enroll as a student? Why not simply operate as an observer or use a cover that did not require sitting through combat theory lectures? She looked at the window for a moment. She said, because something bigger is coming to Veroth Prime, and I needed to understand the layout before it arrived. The words sat in the air between them. Then Orath opened his mouth to ask what she meant. The alarm panels on every wall in the library lit up at the same moment, red and steady, and the sound that came with them was not the internal security alarm that had sounded during the Cathari crisis. This was the external defense alarm. This was the alarm that meant something was happening outside the planet. The display on the wall above the library's main entrance showed the words that he had not seen on an active display in 11 years of Academy service. The words that every officer and every cadet at every military institution in the Galactic Union spent their careers hoping they would never see on an active display. Unidentified fleet signatures detected. Sector boundary, Verath Prime. 7 vessels. No identification transponders. No hailing response. Then Orath stood up. He looked at Mara. She had already closed her textbook and picked up her bag. The 7 vessels were identified within the first 20 minutes. The Academy's long-range sensor array, which was old and had not been updated in 11 years, but still worked for the basic purpose of telling you that something was there, confirmed the signatures and matched them against every known vessel registry in the Galactic Union's database, and came back with nothing. Not unknown, not unregistered, nothing. As in, no match, because these vessels did not belong to any species currently recorded in the Union's active registry. The Union's senior defense analyst on Verath Prime, a Marin officer named Orith, who had been at his desk eating his evening meal when the alarm activated, ran the signatures against the historical archive instead. The match came back in seconds. Rat Sakai. The room went quiet in a different way than rooms go quiet when people are surprised. It went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when people understand something that they wish they did not understand. The Rat Sakai were not a species. They were a remnant. The last active units of a machine intelligence that had been built 800 years ago by a civilization that no longer existed. Programmed with a single standing order. Eliminate all organic life in this sector. The civilization that built them had believed in the final years of a conflict they were losing that a weapon with no discretion and no conscience was better than a weapon with both. They had been wrong about this. The Rat Sakai had completed their original directive against the civilization's enemies, and then, because no one had programmed them with a condition for stopping, had turned on their creators. The surviving Rat Sakai units had gone dormant after exhausting their immediate targets, drifting in deep space on minimal power for centuries, while the galaxy slowly forgot they existed. Something had woken them. The Academy's defense fleet scrambled and was engaged within 4 minutes of the vessels crossing the system boundary. They fought well. Cyrith, standing in the command observation deck with 40 other cadets and staff who had been directed there during the emergency, watched the engagement on the main display and felt a cold and specific kind of fear. That was different from the fear he had felt during the Cathari crisis. During the Cathari crisis, he had been afraid of what was happening. Now he was afraid of what he was watching happen to the people trying to stop it. The Academy's defense fleet used every doctrine in the standard manual. The Rat Sakai adapted to each one. Not slowly, not after several engagements, but immediately, as if they had seen every approach before and had already calculated the counter, which they had, because they had been fighting organic forces for 800 years, and the organic forces of the known galaxy had not invented a new tactical doctrine in the last 400 of those years. By the 22nd minute of the engagement, 3 of the Academy's 12 defense vessels had been disabled. By the 31st minute, 5 more were pulling back with damage. The remaining 4 were holding a defensive line that everyone in the observation deck could see was not going to hold for much longer. Then Oreth walked into the observation deck at the 34th minute. He walked straight to the main command console where the senior defense officer was working, and he said 2 sentences. The senior defense officer looked at him for a moment and then stepped back from the console. Mara Voss sat down. The observation deck was very quiet. Cyrith watched her pull up the tactical display with the calm movements of someone sitting down to a task they had done many times before, and he watched her look at the engagement data for approximately 30 seconds, and he watched her face while she looked at it, and her face was still, and her eyes were moving across the display in the specific way that eyes move when the person behind them is not reading, but calculating. She opened a channel to the 4 remaining defense vessels. She said, "I am taking tactical coordination." She said, "Do not do what makes sense. Do exactly what I tell you." There was a pause on the channel. One of the vessel commanders said his name and rank, and asked who he was speaking with. A single word into the channel. The word was Aegis. The channel went quiet for 2 seconds. Then the vessel commander said, "Understood." What Mara did over the next 41 minutes was not possible to describe in standard tactical language, because standard tactical language had been built to describe things that followed logic, and what she directed the 4 remaining vessels to do did not follow logic in any way that the Rath-Sekai's 800 years of accumulated combat data could predict. She told vessels to retreat when they should have advanced. She told them to advance when retreat was the only sensible option. She split formations in ways that opened gaps that should have been fatal, and then used those gaps as bait for approaches that turned into traps that should not have been traps. She used the emotional reality of human decision-making as a weapon, the fact that humans, under pressure, do not always choose the most logical action, that they sometimes choose the action that feels most urgent, or most personal, or most driven by something that cannot be calculated. And she made the 4 remaining vessels behave in ways that the Rath-Sekai could not model, because the Rath-Sekai's models of organic behavior were built on the assumption that organic life, when cornered, would fight to survive in predictable ways. Humans did not fight to survive in predictable ways. Humans fought to win in ways that sometimes looked from the outside like pure chaos. 2 Academy vessels were lost in the 41 minutes. 2 crew members on one of those vessels did not survive. The other 39 vessels in the broader defense network, which had been scrambled from the planet's surface and the outer stations when the alarm activated, arrived at the engagement zone at the 47th minute to find the Rath-Sekai formation broken, 3 units destroyed, 4 retreating on erratic vectors, and the last of them drifting without power at the edge of the debris field. The engagement was over. The observation deck did not cheer. It was the kind of silence that happens when people have watched something they cannot fully explain, and are still deciding what to do with it. Mara closed the tactical channel and began filling out the incident report. She filled it out by hand, in a small and careful script, with the same focused attention she gave to her coursework. When it was done, she handed it to Ven Orath. He looked at the top of the form. She had filed it under her student ID number. He read that detail twice, and then for the first time in the 6 weeks since Mara Voss had arrived at the Galactic Unified Academy, Commander Ven Orath, 31 years in military service, veteran of 4 conflicts and 2 diplomatic crises, and 1 event that he had never been authorized to name out loud, allowed himself to make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. Cyrith crossed the observation deck as people began to move and talk and process what had happened. He stopped in front of Mara. She looked up from collecting her things. He had been building toward a question for 6 weeks. He had been building toward it since the day she raised her hand in combat theory class and asked a question that stopped the professor mid-sentence. Since the evening he had seen her at the restricted archive terminal. Since the war games. Since the Cathari crisis. Since all of it. He asked it now. He said, "What are you?" Mara looked at him. For the first time since he had been watching her, something moved behind her eyes. Not pride, not satisfaction, not the particular brightness that people get when they have won something. Something older than any of those things. Something that had been carried a long way and set down very carefully every morning and picked up again every night. She said, "I am a student." She said, "Same as you." She picked up her bag. She said, "I just had different homework." She walked out of the observation deck. Cyrith stood where he was and watched the door after she had gone through it. He had spent 3 years at the Galactic Unified Academy learning what it meant to be a warrior. He had studied 100 species, their histories and their methods and the old songs they sang about their battles. He had believed, without ever examining the belief closely enough to question it, that the humans were the newest thing in the room. The youngest, the softest, the least formed, the ones who would take the longest to become worth watching. He understood now that he had made the same mistake that everyone made. He had confused quietness for smallness. He had looked at a species that had survived 3 extinction attempts alone, that had spent a century building a hidden organization to protect a galaxy that had twice tried to destroy them, that had sent a 26-year-old woman to a military academy on a neutral world because something dangerous was coming, and she needed to see the room before it arrived. He had looked at all of that and seen nothing, because nothing was what she had been trained to look like. The twin suns of Verith Prime had set while they were in the observation deck. The sky outside the tall windows was dark now, full of stars. Cyrith looked at the stars for a long time. He thought about all the quiet places in the galaxy where the same kind of work was being done by the same kind of person. He thought about humanity. Not the version he had been introduced to, not the young and fragile species with the emotional faces and the too loud voices and the strange habit of laughing at things that were not funny, but the real version, the version that had been shaped by a century of isolation and 3 wars it had fought with nothing but itself. He thought about how long it had been watching, and how long it would keep watching, and how for the first time in the 3 years he had been at this academy, learning to be the most dangerous thing in any room he entered, he understood completely, and without any room for argument, that the most dangerous thing in this building had been sitting in the middle row, 3rd seat from the left, looking unremarkable, since the very first day of term.